I knew that little Ann had scented the coon in the air, the same as the ghost coon. I walked over and knelt down by her side. The things I wanted to say I couldn't, for the knot in my throat, but I'm sure she understood. As we came into the campground, the hunters came out of their tents and gathered around us. The judge held up the 3 big coon hides. There was a roar from the crowd. One man said, "That was the most beautiful sight I've ever seen." "What was a beautiful sight?" Grandpa asked. "Last night those little red hounds brought that coon right through camp." The judge said, "We figured they did when we heard the noise." Laughing, the man said, "We heard them when they ran up the riverside, the other side of the river. Way up above there, they crossed over. Above here, they crossed over. We could tell they were coming back, so we doused all the fires, and sure enough, they came right through the camp. Those 2 little hounds weren't 50 yards behind the coon, running side by side. Boy, they were picking them up and laying them down and bawling every time their feet touched the ground. I'll tell you, it was the prettiest sight I ever saw." When the judge started telling about the last coon little Ann had treed, I took my dogs over to our tent and fed and watered them. After they had had their fill, I gave them a good rub down with a piece of gunny sack. Taking them out to the buggy, I tied them up. As I stood and watched while they twisted around in the hay making their bed. That day I tried to get some sleep in our tent, but the soaking grandpa had taken in the river had given him a cold, causing him to snore. I had never heard such a racket in my life. I'd have sworn he rattled the paper sacks in our grocery boxes. Taking a blanket, I ran out to my dogs. Little Ann had wriggled up as close to old Dan as she could. Prying them apart, I lay down and fell between them and fell asleep. The last night of the eliminations turned out like the second night. None of the judges turned in more than 2 hides. That day, about noon, the owners of the other winning teams and I were called for a conference with the head judge. He said, "Gentlemen, the eliminations are over. Only 3 sets of hounds are left for the runoff. The winner of tonight's hunt will receive the Gold Cup. If there is a tie for the championship, naturally there will be another runoff." He shook hands with each of us and wished us good luck. Tension began to build up in the camp. Here and there, hunters were standing in small groups talking. Others could be seen going in and out of tents with rolls of money in their hands. Grandpa was the busiest one of all. His voice could be heard all over the camp. Men were looking at me and talking in low tones. I strutted like a turkey gobbler. That evening, while we were having supper, a hunter dropped by. He had a small box in his hand. Smiling, he said, "Everyone has agreed that we should have a jackpot for the winner. I've been picked to do the collecting." Grandpa said, "You may as well leave it here now." Looking at me, the hunter said, "Son, I think almost every man in this camp is hoping you win it, but it's not going to be easy. You're up against 4 of the finest hounds there are." Turning to my father, he said, Did you know the 2 big Walker hounds have won 4 gold cups?" Very seriously, Papa said, "You know, I have 2 mules down at my place. One is almost as big as a barn. The other one isn't much bigger than a jackrabbit, but that little mule can outpull the big one every time." Smiling, the hunter turned to leave. He said, "Could be right." Papa asked me again where I thought we should start hunting. I had been thinking about this all day. I said, "You remember where we jumped the last coon in the swamp?" Papa said, "Yes." "Well, the way I figure, more than 1 coon lives in that swamp," I said. "It's a good place for them, as there are lots of crawfish and minnows in those potholes. If a hound jumps one out there, he has a good chance to tree him." Papa asked, "Why?" "It's a long way back to the river, and about the same distance to the mountains," I said. "Either way he runs, a dog can get pretty close to them, and so he would have to take to a tree." That evening we climbed into Grandpa's buggy and headed for the swamp. It was dark by the time we reached it. Grandpa handed Papa his gun, saying, "You're getting to be a pretty good shot with this thing. I hope I get to shoot at a lot tonight, Papa said. Under my breath, I said, I do too. After untying the ropes from my dogs, I held on to their collars for a minute. Pulling them up close, I knelt down and whispered, This is the last night. I know you'll do your best. They seemed to understand and tugged at their collars. When I turned them loose, they started for the timber. Just as they reached the dark shadows, they stopped, turned around, and stared straight at me for an instant. The judge saw their actions. Laying a hand on my shoulder, he asked, What'd they say, son? I said, Nothing that anyone could understand. But I can feel they know this hunt is important. They know it just as well as you or I. It was Little Ann who found the trail. Before the echo of her sharp cry had died away, old Dan's deep voice floated out of the swamp. Well, let's go, Pop said eagerly. No, let's wait a minute, I said. Wait, why? Grandpa asked. To see which way he's going to run, I said. The coon broke out of the swamp and headed for the river. Listening to my dogs, I could tell they were close to him. I said to Papa, I don't think he'll ever make it to the river. They're right on his heels now. By the time we had circled the swamp, they were bawling treed. The judge said, Boy, that was fast. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. Looking at me, he smiled and nodded his head. Papa and I knew I had judged the coon perfectly. He didn't have time to reach the river or the mountains. My dogs had treed the coon in a tall ash which stood about 50 yards from the river. I knew the 50 yards had saved us a good hour, because he could have pulled trick after trick if he had gotten in the water. We spied the coon in the topmost branches. At the crack of the gun, he ran far out on a limb and jumped. He landed in an old fallen treetop. He scooted through it. Coming out on the other side, he ran for the river. The tangled mass of limbs showed my dogs, and they were all but tore the treetop apart getting out. And they all but tore the treetop apart getting out of it. The coon was just one step ahead of them as they reached the river. We heard them hit the water. Running over, we stood and watched the fight. The coon was at home in the river. He crawled up on old Dan's head, trying to force him under. But before he could do it, Little Ann reached up and pulled him off. In a scared voice, Papa said, That water looks deep to me. Maybe you had better call them off, said the judge. That's a big coon, and he could drown one of them easily in that deep water. Call them off, I said. Why, you couldn't whip them off with a stick. There's no use for anyone to get scared. They know exactly what they're doing. I've seen this more times than one. Grandpa was scared and excited. He was jumping up and down, whooping and hollering. Papa raised the gun to aim. I jumped and grabbed his arm. Don't do that, I yelled. You're sure to hit one of my dogs. Round and round in the deep water, the fight went on. The coon climbed on old Dan's head and sank his teeth in one of his long, tender ears. Old Dan bawled with pain. Little Ann came in and caught one of the coon's hind legs in her mouth. She tried hard to pull him off. All three disappeared under the water. I held my breath. The water churned and boiled. All three came to the top about the same time. The coon was between the bank we were standing on and my dogs. He swam towards us. They caught him again just as he reached the shore. He fought his way free and ran for a large sycamore. Old Dan caught him just as he started up. I knew that was the end of the fight. After it was all over and the coon had been skinned, Grandpa said, I hope we don't have to go through that again tonight. For a while, I sure thought your dogs were gunners. The judge said, Well, have you ever seen that? Look over there. Old Dan was standing perfectly still with his eyes closed and his head hanging down. Little Ann was looking at his cut and bleeding ears. She always does that, I said. If you watch, when she's done with him, he'll do the same for her. We stood and watched until they had finished doctoring each other. Then, trotting side by side, they disappeared into the darkness. We then followed along, stopping now and then to listen. To be continued. This is getting good.